this is a slow time, but nothing ever stops, of course. Big Ten football media days right around the corner. And speaking of Indiana football, they've been piling up a nice list of recruits. They've landed guys that chose the Hoosiers over non-MAC teams. It's a lot of times you see the guys that commit that, oh, well, they picked them over Bowling Green and Kent and yada, yada. But man, this is Purdue and Michigan State and they're picking up some solid players, and especially here of late on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think you're sort of seeing, maybe to begin with, the way that Curt Cignetti and his staff kind of want a recruiting sort of window or a recruiting, cycle to unfold. I think more and more you're seeing players want to commit, in the spring and summertime. Obviously, you're allowed greater sort of freedom around, when you can visit, like at what point you can start taking official visits, and we're seeing guys on campus earlier. Obviously, the other part of this, and the winter signing window isn't new at this point, but I think what everybody's figured out is it's probably best to have your recruiting process done, if possible, before the start of your senior year, not just because of, maybe the need to, or the desire to have that, just not have the stress and the questions and, to have to kind of be going through the process while you're playing in your senior season, but also because ultimately you can get to the end of it. And because the signing window is so, kind of just like right around the corner once high school season's in, you may not have many options. You may not have a ton of schools, left that have held a spot for you and still have a place for you in their class. And so I think you're seeing, more and more just in general, the recruiting calendar in football moving into even more focus in the spring and summer of kids' junior year into their senior year than maybe it even was, 10, 15 years ago. And I think that you're kind of seeing the coupling from Indiana's perspective of, that to maybe what this staff wants to do, how this staff wants the ideal sort of recruiting window to unfold. And yeah, they've added, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, you can pick out rankings however you want, but there are a lot of guys, just generally speaking, that, are well regarded by the recruiting services, as you talk about, have, some really good offer lists. Obviously you've got some guys in there, like a recent commit, Davion Chandler, who's not just a local kid, but you flipped him from Illinois. It is interesting to me that there are 4 kids from the state in this class. So it's clear that even though this staff, people sort of asked when this staff was hired, how quickly can they build relationships in the state? It does seem like the staff has actually kind of been able to do that fairly quickly. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, their first commitment was an in-state kid, Evan Parker from Carmel. So it seems like they've been able to move, fairly quickly on that front. So, time will tell. I mean, recruiting classes are always, kind of I always do like a retrospective near the end of every season, looking back basically at the class 3.5 years earlier and what kind of became of it. You do kind of need that time to really judge a class in its entirety. But it's interesting to see, the way this staff has gone about, again, building those relationships and moving quickly between, maybe some of the guys that you're targeting in state, and then obviously also probably, tapping into some of the connections you already have. I mean, for example, Indiana, I think, has 2 kids from Tennessee, 2 from Georgia, only 1 from Florida, which obviously has been a focus in the past. So you feel like maybe the relationships have moved to some different places, as they always will with the staff. And it's just kind of been interesting to see it kind of develop.
All right, Zach, you're much like someone like Dustin DePirick. You're a much calmer, much more calming take on things than, say, someone like myself. So I sit here every day and I look at the Indiana football schedule and the games that are laid out, and I'm like, okay, I hate saying it because it sounds unbelievable, but when I'm looking at that schedule, the possibilities are kind of weird in a good way, all in a very good way. Of course, you start with the 8 home games, and then the kind of a linchpin game with UCLA, which, losing that game doesn't hurt you, but that's a winnable game possibly. And if you were able to pull that off, now you've got a possibility of not only going 5-0, but 6-0 with the schedule the way it is. And I know that sounds ludicrous and crazy on its face, but that possibility is actually there for the Hoosiers.
No, I don't think it's crazy. I mean, I don't think it's. I obviously wouldn't necessarily like predict it to happen. What's interesting is, I talked to a good friend of mine who covers Nebraska forgive me, I think one of your competing recruiting networks, but I've known Robin for years, and he just kind of did like basically an opposition sort of.
Oh, Robin Washut.
Yeah, Robin's great, and it's just kind of like a talk to somebody about, this week it's Indiana. We're looking at all the opponents, for the coming season. And it's funny because he and I kind of had this back and forth where basically Indiana and Nebraska are kind of in the same boat. Obviously not from the perspective of a first-year coach, second-year coach, all that. But Nebraska fans kind of feel the same way about their schedule that Indiana fans feel about theirs. And if you look at it, they got UTEP at home, Colorado at home, Northern Iowa at home, Illinois at home. They go to Purdue. They have Rutgers at home. And then they play Indiana. And the flip side to that is, on the backside of that, they have Ohio State on the road, USC on the road, Iowa on the road, and Wisconsin at home. So there's kind of that same feeling with Nebraska, and I think Northwestern's schedule sets up somewhat similarly. The point is, Indiana is one of a number of teams that is kind of looking at that schedule and saying, if we can get some wind in our sails, if we can get, just a little bit of momentum behind us, there's a path to, comfortable bowl eligibility and maybe being a team that's firing upward, punching up come November rather than kind of fighting off the negative momentum. And I mean, this is the first year I can remember where I've got Indiana's football schedule memorized in June. And the reason why is because whenever somebody asks me about IU football and like what are expectations in Curt Cignetti's first season, what do fans want, whatever, I say a really big part of the narrative of this season is going to be carried by the schedule. And whether it is as forgiving as it looks like it is, Indiana, I can tell you right now, FIU, Western Illinois, at UCLA, Charlotte, Maryland, at Northwestern, Nebraska, Washington, at Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, Purdue, whether it is, or at Ohio State, Purdue, whether it is as forgiving as it seems like it is when you don't have to play Penn State, you don't have to play USC, you don't have to play Wisconsin, and you don't face Michigan or Ohio State until week 10 of your season. Number one, is it that forgiving? Number two, can Indiana make some hay out of that? That is ultimately a big part of the narrative of this season. 8 home games. You're finally free of the meat grinder of the Big Ten East. You've actually wound up potentially with a schedule that could be, as I said, forgiving. You don't know what Nebraska will be. You don't quite know what Northwestern will be. UCLA, Washington, and Michigan State all have new head coaches too. You've bought out of the Louisville series to basically do your best to guarantee you a 3-0 non-conference schedule, which is completely fine. Maryland has got a ton of question marks in sort of the post-Talia Tagovailoa era. He was so important to that team and that team's success over the last 2 or 3 years. Like, yeah, it's not hard to talk yourself into the idea that Indiana could be 4-1, 5-1. If you want to play the tape all the way through to the Michigan game, could already have 7 or maybe even 8 wins. But the flip side is you also look at Indiana as a team and you say, okay, but there's not a lot of defensive depth. They're going to need some luck with injuries. We're making a lot of assumptions about the offense based on the staff's past track record. The reality is Indiana's probably going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 new starters on offense next season. Probably at least 8, I would guess. Injuries depending. So, you can kind of have this conversation with yourself in both directions is kind of the point. But what is interesting to me, the reason I bring up that conversation I had with Robin, is Indiana's not alone in that boat. There are a lot of teams in the Big Ten, and in particular, weirdly, a lot of teams on Indiana's schedule that I think are kind of having the same conversation with themselves this summer. And the question is basically just, can Indiana be one of the ones that rises above that before anyone else can?
I agree 1,000%. And normally you look at the schedule and there's 4 to 5 losses that you're like, oh, that's going to be a loss. That's going to be a loss. And I've looked at it. I'm like, okay, well, I see 2 for sure. Now I don't even know that it's 2 for sure, because Michigan, there's 2 out of the 9 Big Ten games that Indiana plays. Those teams have a new coach or a new coach within the last 2 seasons. So that's a lot of change going on. And Indiana is also in that boat, but Indiana is, and I don't know if it's because I am seeing it from closer up, but the buzz at Indiana has just been a positive, upward trending buzz. I don't know that I have really heard or felt that out of, say, Purdue. Nebraska played well last year. I don't know if what's going to happen with them, but there's just so much uncertainty that it allows for opportunity and hope for Indiana football fans.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, you don't want to get out over your skis. And I know there are some people who will say, it's IU football until it's not, like that kind of thing. I also just think generally, like if we're talking about like the range of median outcomes, if you have all of these teams that essentially look at their schedule and their roster and say, hey, this could be our year, then the likeliest, outcome to me is that it winds up being everyone's year to a point. Like everyone kind of winds up somewhere between 5-7 and 7-5, essentially. But no, I don't think, I guess that, what I would say, like as trying to sit here and be as objective as possible, what I would say is that I would not begrudge any IU football fan some genuine optimism. That's not to say it is, completely and utterly, unfounded, optimism. That's not to say that it's that Indiana fans, that's not to say it can't go wrong. It always can. IU fans certainly will know that from experience. But when you look at the team, when you look at the momentum around the program, when you look at, frankly, the head coaches, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, the head coach position is important. Indiana's got a guy who wins. Now, he's never had to compete at this level, but he wins. And that's, he's got a long track record of that wherever he's been, whatever the level, whatever was required. So I just think that, ultimately I think there are plenty of legitimate reasons for Indiana fans to look at what's in front of them right now and say, why not? Why can't IU football be relevant at this kind of level this season, given everything Curt Cignetti's done in the past, given, what he and his staff have been able to do thus far, in terms of roster building and recruiting and things like that. But, you'll have to see, because again, the thing I come back to so much is, if Indiana can't go 3-0 in the non-conference, then this conversation is probably academic and there's really no, it doesn't really matter. But if you set aside an assumed 3-0 non-conference slate, UCLA, Northwestern, Indiana, Michigan State, Nebraska, and Washington, those are, and I guess Purdue as well, those are all kind of swing games for Indiana, where it's not so much that Indiana can win any of them. It's more that we just don't know enough about any of those teams in their various situations to just flatly say Indiana cannot beat them. And those are all teams, every one of them, with a first or a second year head coach, and including Indiana, it's worth saying. And a fair bit of roster turnover in the last 12 to 18 months in different cases. Obviously, Northwestern has dealt with some some tumult in their program, and they're going to be playing in a temporary stadium and all this. And you got Washington, which is going to be coming into the Big Ten for the first time with a head coach who was successful at Arizona, but it took him some time to get going. And you've got Michigan State, who's got a really promising head coach, I think, in Jonathan Smith. But again, how quickly does he translate from Oregon State in the Pac-12 into the Big Ten? And the other part of this too is, with a Nebraska or an Indiana, I haven't looked at every one of these team schedules. Some of these teams probably don't have as comfortable of a September, October. And we've seen Indiana seasons where it felt like if the games could have fallen in a different order, maybe Indiana could have had a better season. But because it got kind of broken up in the middle by a really difficult stretch, it winds up kind of slowing the whole thing down. Can Indiana be a team that builds that momentum and almost kind of hits cruise control a little bit, or cruising speed? The point is, it's all played on paper, obviously, until we get to the end of August and the beginning of September. But I think there is a fascinating middle of the Big Ten this season in this first year of 18 teams. And Indiana right now, justifiably, is part of that.
Hello, everybody. Jim Coyle with Indiana Sports Beat Radio, and thank you for enjoying our content and videos. And make sure you hit that subscribe and notifications toggle so you don't miss out on anything, whether it's Indiana Hoosiers, the Boilers, the Colts, the Pacers, Indiana high school action, whatever is happening in sports. We're trying to bring it all to you, and make sure you don't miss out on a thing. Again, hit the subscribe button for us. Helps us out a ton. We appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much.